Forget everything you think you know about Iran's missile capabilities and what happened to Israel's nuclear deterrent in the early hours of last Tuesday morning. Let me be clear about something the Pentagon is desperately hoping you will not understand. Iran fired a Shahab-3 ballistic missile directly at Dimona, Israel's nuclear weapons production facility, and that missile hit its target. Not a nearby military installation, not an airfield 20 kilometers away, but Dimona itself. I need you to understand what that means, and I need you to understand it right now, because what I am about to explain to you represents the single most significant shift in Middle Eastern power dynamics in 50 years. Having spent decades in military intelligence, having served as a weapons inspector who walked through facilities exactly like Dimona, having sat in rooms where nuclear proliferation scenarios were war-gamed until 3 in the morning, I can tell you with absolute certainty that what occurred last Tuesday changes everything. The calculus that has governed this region since 1967 just evaporated. Here is what happened. At approximately 2:47 in the morning local time, Israeli air defense radar stations detected a launch signature from Iranian territory consistent with a medium-range ballistic missile. The trajectory analysis that scrolled across screens at Israeli Defense Force Southern Command headquarters showed an apogee consistent with the Shahab-3 flight profile, arcing up through the mesosphere before beginning its terminal descent phase. Impact occurred at 2:53, roughly 6 minutes after launch, which matches the flight time for a 1,300-kilometer range engagement. The target was the Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona, the facility where Israel has maintained its undeclared nuclear weapons program since the 1960s. This was not a symbolic strike. This was not a message. This was a functional demonstration that Iran can hit the most protected, most critical strategic asset in the Israeli arsenal whenever it chooses to do so. Now, let me walk you through exactly what the Shahab-3 represents, because understanding the weapon system tells you everything about Iranian strategic intent. The Shahab-3 traces its developmental lineage to the North Korean Nodong-1 design, a missile that itself derived from Soviet Scud technology, modified and extended by North Korean engineers through the 1990s. Iran acquired the technical specifications and began indigenous production in the mid-1990s, publicly unveiling the weapon in 1998. The baseline Shahab-3 has an operational range of approximately 1,300 kilometers, with a payload capacity of 760 kilograms. Extended variants designated Shahab-3B and Shahab-3ER push that range toward 2,000 kilometers. The guidance system employs inertial navigation supplemented by stellar navigation updates during mid-course flight, providing a circular error probable, that is the radius within which half of all missiles will impact, of approximately 30 to 50 meters for the upgraded variants. That level of accuracy, combined with the payload capacity, means this missile was designed from inception to deliver high-yield warheads against fixed strategic targets. The payload bay dimensions, the warhead interface specifications, the accuracy parameters, every element of this system was oriented toward nuclear employment. What you need to understand about Dimona is that this facility represents the existential core of Israeli strategic deterrence. This is not a conventional military installation that can be rebuilt if destroyed. This is where Israel produces tritium for thermonuclear weapons. This is where weapons-grade plutonium gets extracted from irradiated fuel assemblies. This is where the physics packages that sit inside Israel's estimated 80 to 90 nuclear warheads were fabricated. The Negev facility operates 2 research reactors, the primary one being a 26-megawatt heavy water reactor that has been producing weapons-grade plutonium since it achieved criticality in 1963. Surrounding that reactor is a reprocessing complex where chemical separation extracts plutonium from spent fuel. Underground, beneath the visible surface structures, are fabrication facilities, storage bunkers, and command nodes that coordinate Israel's nuclear triad delivery systems. You cannot replace this infrastructure quickly. You cannot relocate it easily. And you absolutely cannot afford to have it struck by incoming ballistic missiles that you cannot intercept. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you next is where this becomes genuinely alarming. Israeli air defense systems failed to intercept the Shahab-3 that hit Dimona. Let me repeat that for absolute clarity. The Arrow 2, the Arrow 3, the David Sling, the multiple layers of integrated air defense that Israel has constructed at staggering cost specifically to defend against Iranian ballistic missiles failed to stop this strike. Now, Israeli Defense Forces issued a statement within 6 hours claiming that air defense systems functioned normally and that damage to the Dimona facility was minimal, limited to administrative buildings on the periphery of the complex. I am telling you right now, based on analysis of the impact dynamics, the flight profile, and the defensive response timeline, that official statement represents damage control rather than damage assessment. When a 760-kilogram warhead impacts at terminal velocity exceeding Mach 5, you do not get minimal damage to administrative buildings. You get structural devastation to anything within a 50-meter radius and severe damage extending to 100 meters. The reason this matters strategically goes far beyond the physical damage to one facility. What Iran demonstrated last Tuesday morning is that it possesses the capability to strike the heart of Israeli nuclear deterrence, and that Israeli defenses cannot reliably prevent such strikes. Think about what that means for every calculation that gets made in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem about escalation management. For 50 years, Israel's strategic posture has rested on the assumption that its nuclear arsenal represents an untouchable deterrent, a final guarantee that no regional adversary can threaten Israel's survival without facing annihilation in return. That assumption just became questionable. If Iran can strike Dimona successfully, then Iran can degrade or potentially eliminate Israeli nuclear capabilities in a first strike scenario, fundamentally altering the strategic balance. Keep watching because the technical reality of what occurred gets worse for Israeli planners. The Shahab 3 that struck Dimona was not launched in isolation. Iranian forces conducted a coordinated salvo launch involving multiple missile types targeting multiple locations across Israeli territory. At least four Khorram-Shar 4 missiles, which are longer-range liquid-fueled systems with 2,000-kilometer reach and 1,500-kilogram payload capacity, struck military logistics installations in northern Israel. Two Fatah-2 missiles, these are the hypersonic variants with unpredictable terminal phase maneuvering, hit air defense radar installations near Haifa. The point of this salvo architecture is saturation. By launching multiple missiles of different types along different trajectories with different flight profiles, Iran overwhelms the decision-making capacity of Israeli air defense networks. Radar operators have to decide in real time which threats to prioritize, which intercept missiles to launch, which targets might be decoys or lower priority strikes. In that decision-making chaos, the highest value strike, the Shahab 3 heading for Dimona, slipped through. What the mainstream media will not tell you is that this represents a preview of Iranian operational doctrine in a full-scale exchange. Iran is not going to launch one or two missiles and hope they get through. Iran is going to launch 50, 100, 200 missiles simultaneously, saturating every layer of Israeli air defense until interception rates collapse and critical infrastructure gets systematically destroyed. Iranian military planners have studied American operations in Iraq, studied Israeli strikes against Hezbollah, studied Russian operations in Ukraine. They understand that modern air defense systems, no matter how sophisticated, have finite magazine depths and decision-making bottlenecks that can be exploited through mass and coordination. The strike on Dimona was proof of concept that this operational approach works against the most defended target in the region. Now, let me tell you what this really means at the strategic level, because here is where most analysis goes completely wrong. Conventional wisdom holds that Israel maintains escalation dominance in the Middle East through its nuclear arsenal and its qualitative military edge. The assumption has always been that if Iran pushes too far, Israel can always escalate to a level where Iran cannot respond effectively. What happened last Tuesday demolishes that assumption. Iran just demonstrated that it can strike Israel's nuclear production capability, which means Iran has created a scenario where Israeli escalation to nuclear use becomes strategically questionable. If you are an Israeli decision maker contemplating nuclear retaliation for some future Iranian action, you now have to consider that Iran might conduct a preemptive strike against Dimona, degrading your nuclear capability before you can employ it. That calculation injects a use it or lose it dynamic into crisis escalation that massively increases the probability of nuclear employment early in any conflict. You think you have heard the worst of it. You have not, not even close. Let me explain what happens when this capability demonstration combines with the broader regional power shifts that have been unfolding over the past 6 months. Iranian-backed forces have effectively achieved deterrence parity with Israel in Lebanon through Hezbollah's precision-guided munition stockpiles. Iranian proxy forces have demonstrated the ability to strike American military installations in Iraq and Syria without triggering overwhelming retaliation. Iranian naval forces have repeatedly demonstrated that they can shut down or severely constrain shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And now Iran has demonstrated that it can strike the core of Israeli strategic deterrence. What you are watching is the systematic elimination of every military advantage that was supposed to guarantee Israeli security and American freedom of action in the region. Before we go any further, I need you to understand exactly what the targeting of Dimona signifies in doctrinal terms. This was not an impulsive decision made in the heat of escalation. This was a calculated choice by Iranian strategic planners to cross a threshold that has been considered absolutely off limits since the beginning of Iran-Israel shadow conflict decades ago. Nuclear facilities occupy a special category in military targeting. Striking them represents an escalation step just below actual nuclear employment because it threatens the adversary's ultimate deterrent capability. Iranian decision-makers knew beyond any doubt that targeting Dimona would be perceived in Israel as an existential threat. They did it anyway. That tells you everything about Iranian confidence in their ability to manage Israeli retaliation and absorb whatever response comes next. Having sat across tables from men who would rather die than show weakness, having watched how Middle Eastern strategic culture actually operates when stripped of diplomatic niceties, I can tell you that this move signals something profound. Iranian leadership has concluded that they have achieved sufficient capability, sufficient regional leverage, and sufficient great power backing to directly challenge Israeli strategic dominance. This is not bluster. This is not propaganda. This is operational demonstration followed by willingness to accept whatever consequences follow. That kind of calculation only happens when decision makers believe the balance of power has fundamentally shifted in their favor. What I have not yet told you is where this truly becomes dangerous for American interests and global stability. The United States has multiple carrier strike groups positioned in the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, specifically to deter Iranian escalation against Israel. The Biden administration has repeatedly stated that American military power guarantees Israeli security and that any Iranian action threatening Israel will meet overwhelming American response. Iranian forces just struck the heart of Israeli nuclear deterrence, and the American response has been limited to diplomatic protests and sanctions threats. That gap between declaratory policy and actual response is being noticed by every actor in the region and every adversary globally. If the United States will not respond decisively when Iran strikes Israeli nuclear facilities, then what will trigger decisive American military action? The answer increasingly appears to be nothing, which means American deterrence credibility throughout the region just collapsed. Let me walk you through exactly why American carriers cannot effectively respond to this scenario, because understanding the operational constraints tells you everything about why Iranian planners felt confident enough to authorize the Dimona strike. American carrier air wings are optimized for power projection against adversaries with limited anti-access capabilities. They can overwhelm weak air defenses, conduct sustained strike operations against poorly protected targets, and maintain air superiority in permissive environments. What they cannot do is operate effectively inside a dense anti-ship missile envelope where a single carrier represents a $13 billion target surrounded by destroyers that each cost $2 billion, all facing saturation attacks from shore-based missile batteries that cost $2 million per launcher. The cost exchange ratio is catastrophically unfavorable for the United States. Losing a single carrier to Iranian anti-ship missiles would represent the worst American military disaster since Pearl Harbor, killing 5,000 personnel and eliminating a capital asset that takes a decade to replace. Iranian anti-ship missile capabilities include the Khalij Fars, an anti-ship ballistic missile with a 300-kilometer range and maneuvering re-entry vehicle designed specifically to target aircraft carriers. They have the Noor, a sea-skimming cruise missile that flies at 15 meters above water and presents minimal radar cross-section until seconds before impact. They have the Gadir, a midget submarine optimized for launching anti-ship torpedoes in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, where American carrier groups have minimal maneuvering space. And they have shore-based artillery and rocket systems that can pummel any American attempt to conduct amphibious operations. The operational reality is that American carriers positioned within 500 kilometers of Iranian territory are operating inside a kill zone where Iranian first strike advantages potentially outweigh American defensive capabilities. This is not just about military hardware. This is about strategic will and pain tolerance. Iranian decision makers have calculated that the United States lacks the political will to accept carrier losses and sustained casualties in defense of Israel when American public opinion has turned increasingly skeptical of Middle Eastern military commitments. They are betting that American domestic politics will constrain any response to airstrikes and standoff weapons rather than the kind of massive retaliation that would actually degrade Iranian capabilities. Based on the pattern of American responses to Iranian actions over the past 4 years, that bet appears entirely rational. Keep watching because the next part is where everything starts to unravel at the global level. What Iran demonstrated with the Dimona strike is not just a bilateral threat to Israel. This is a template for how regional powers with sophisticated missile arsenals can neutralize American security guarantees and challenge the entire post-1945 international order. If Iran can effectively deter Israeli and American retaliation by demonstrating the ability to strike critical strategic targets, then what prevents North Korea from doing the same thing in East Asia? What prevents Russia from conducting similar demonstrations against NATO facilities in Eastern Europe? What prevents China from using this playbook against American bases in Japan and Guam? The Iranian model is exportable, and every revisionist power on earth is taking notes. The second-order consequences cascade through regional alliance structures that have anchored American strategy for 70 years. Saudi Arabia watches Iranian missiles hit Dimona and sees that American security guarantees cannot protect even the most critical Israeli assets. What does that tell Saudi leadership about the value of American commitments to Saudi security? The Gulf states have spent decades aligning their security policies with American preferences, specifically because they believed American military power was reliable and overwhelming. If Iranian capabilities now raise credible doubts about American ability to protect regional allies, then why should those allies continue accepting American constraints on their own strategic options? You are watching the dissolution of the regional security architecture that prevented proliferation cascades and great power competition for half a century. This is not just about the Middle East. This is about the fundamental structure of international order. American power since 1945 has rested on the ability to project overwhelming military force globally and to extend security guarantees that made allied nuclear weapons programs unnecessary. If regional powers now believe they can develop capabilities that neutralize American power projection, and if allies now doubt American willingness to accept costs in their defense, then the entire logic of the international system starts coming apart. You get proliferation cascades as states conclude they need independent nuclear deterrence. You get regional arms races as neighbors compete for advantage. You get great power competition expanding into regions that had been relatively stable under American hegemony. The next 72 hours will determine whether Israeli leadership concludes that the only way to restore deterrence is through overwhelming retaliation that might include nuclear demonstration strikes. Decisions being made right now, as we speak, in secure facilities in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are weighing the risks of escalation against the risks of accepting this new strategic reality. I cannot tell you which way those decisions will go. What I can tell you is that every option involves catastrophic risks that were not present in the strategic calculus 48 hours ago. If Israel conducts a major retaliatory strike against Iranian nuclear facilities or Iranian leadership, you get a regional war that could pull in American forces directly. If Israel does not respond decisively, you validate Iranian conclusions that their capabilities have achieved effective deterrence, encouraging further aggressive actions. I wish I could tell you something more reassuring, but the honest answer, however uncomfortable, is that the strike on Dimona represents a threshold crossing from which there is no easy return. The strategic stability that kept this region from spiraling into catastrophic warfare has depended on clear understanding of capability hierarchies and red lines. That understanding just became ambiguous when strategic adversaries are uncertain about capabilities, uncertain about resolve, and uncertain about how the other side will respond to provocations. Miscalculation becomes dramatically more likely. We are entering a period of heightened danger where any incident, any miscommunication, any tactical mistake has the potential to cascade into wider conflict. What happened at Dimona is the future. Sophisticated regional powers using precision strike capabilities to threaten the strategic assets of more powerful adversaries who can no longer confidently defend their most critical infrastructure. The technology has proliferated, the operational concepts have been validated, the willingness to accept escalation risks has been demonstrated. This is the world we are living in now, where missile forces can challenge naval forces, where regional powers can deter great powers, where security guarantees that seemed ironclad a decade ago now appear dangerously fragile. You need to understand that reality because the decisions your government makes in response will shape everything about global security for the next generation. The clock is running and the window for restoring strategic stability is closing rapidly.